America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Alfredo Ortiz, CEO of Job Creators Network.
And please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or anywhere you get your podcast from. Well, Alfredo, today we're going to be joined by Rafael Cuellar. He's the owner of ShopRite Supermarkets in, is it Passaic City? Is that how you pronounce it? Passaic City, New Jersey. And he's going to be discussing what it takes to survive and thrive in this competitive, low-margin business and all the threats that face him with bad government policy. And of course, being in New Jersey, I'm sure he's got some great stories to talk about because that is probably one of the most anti-business friendly states I can think of in the country.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I'm excited to talk to Rafael. It's been a few years since we've really had a chance to talk to him. But boy, he has been such a great success story. He's gone even beyond the grocery store chains, and we're going to hear about that. But he's really expanded his business and gone far beyond the grocery business. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say about that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I know that he was working hard at ShopRite and everything like that, but you know, the grocery store business is just such a low margin business. So
Yeah.
it's diversification, of course, would be so important in that regard. But with all of the threats facing not only businesses like Rafael's, but businesses across the country, we launched the American Small Business Prosperity Plan last fall. With Newt Gingrich, former Speaker Newt Gingrich. And it was really, I think you called it just a simple 8-point plan, not a 150-point plan, but an 8-point plan that's really simple. And it starts with, basic things that need to be done to help our small businesses continuing recovering from this pandemic. Like making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent and, moving forward on more domestic oil exploration and importantly, helping businesses get more access to credit, which, you've talked a lot about. I don't know if you want to expand on that right now.
Well, it's a real concern for our small business owners. In fact, our latest SBIQ poll, small business IQ poll, says that 2/3 of our small businesses are concerned about access to credit now, because when the Federal Reserve had to increase the interest rates by over 5 points over the past year to basically combat Biden inflation, it's had a real negative impact on our small business owners via access to credit, because as these banks have to deal with increasing interest rates, it really does limit their ability to actually give credit to folks. And so there's been a real shutdown basically in the credit market to our small business owners.
Absolutely. And I know that you've talked to some folks along the way who have shared some of their concerns about not being able to get access to credit, particularly in their community banks, with some of those bank failures earlier this year. And you've got people out there like Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank saying, we don't need community banks. Who cares? Let them go. 5 banks is enough in the country.
Yeah, Kevin O'Leary. Unfortunately, he probably has never run actually a small business, or if he did, and he completely forgets what it's like. But right now, that is not the conversation that we need to be having, promoting the elimination of our community banks and our regional banks, because that is where most of our small businesses access credit from. About 80% of all small business loans actually are originating in our regional and small community banks.
Yeah, I love a lot of what he says, though. I mean, he called out business environments like New Jersey and New York up in the Northeast as being very anti-business friendly.
Yeah,
He talked about, Elon Musk came out and said everybody needs to go back to the office. And he said, why? I'm hiring people in South Dakota that are doing a great job remotely. I don't need them to come to an office. So I
right.
love some of the things he's saying, but the banking side of things was a disappointment because he came out
Yeah,
so strong in calling out who was to blame for it, and that it was the economic, the just the environment in general of the overspending, and then the inflation, and then what the banks had to do, and it kind of caught the regional banks, off guard with such an increase in the interest rates. I mean, all of that was right until he got to that point with the community banks, and you're right. It probably has to do with his perspective of just forgetting what it's like to be a small business.
well, and the concern is that his ultimate, push is that we only will need maybe 10 to 12 national mega banks. I mean, I am sorry, but that's not. We're not Canada. We're not Japan, which is where the situation is. And look, most of those countries don't have small businesses really, and so our small businesses need and thrive on our community banks and the access to credit that they provide. And so, I'm going to be pushing back on Mr. Wonderful because on this he's Mr. No No.
Absolutely. And of course, getting our fiscal spending under control. I
Yeah,
mean, 30 over $30 trillion in debt. It's driven up inflation. We have to be able to get our spending under control. You and I have to do it in our own households. Everyday ordinary Americans have to do it. I mean, it's time to sit down and talk about getting, our
right.
fiscal house in order.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more like I think 33 trillion, but yeah, it's only a rounding error.
Only a few children. I think it becomes like monopoly money to people as they just kind of your eyes glaze over. You can't even fathom what $33 trillion looks like. It's
It's a
monopoly
lot
money
of
at this point.
zeros.
Yeah, exactly. But excitingly enough, in our last few minutes before we bring Rafael on, I want to highlight one more of the elements of the American Small Business Prosperity Plan, and that's the regulatory reform, because we've had so much success with that.
Yeah.
In I know you worked very closely with Senator Ernst on the regulatory reform and the Prove It Act. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, overall, I mean, we've had an environment in terms of legislations that it's a one size fits all, and just that is not a system that really works. And we just need to look at Dodd Frank probably as the biggest disaster of that, which was, banking regulatory reform when the economic crisis hit the last time around. And look what happened. We had over 2,000 community banks that actually went out of business because of that. And what happened? The big banks only got bigger, and so we have to avoid this kind of thought process and mentality in Congress that one legislation should fit all, and so we need to have legislation like the Prove It Act that actually pushes back and says, "Look, we need to evaluate the impact on our small businesses when it comes to all legislation." And so, and you have to prove out that it doesn't impact our small business, and if so, it gives us an opportunity to actually go back and fix that regulation to probably have basically a two-path type of legislation. And so the Prove It Act is a great first step. It doesn't go probably as far as we will ultimately need to get to, but it's an amazing first step.
Absolutely, and it makes them do their job. It makes the
Right.
legislators and the bureaucrats do their jobs when they're looking at new regulations, because these are the agencies that are going to be implementing some of these regulations. They're unelected bureaucrats. They don't understand, probably, nor do they care how it
Right.
impacts our small business owners. And so the reality is, if they want that regulation to be enacted, and that everybody has to follow that same rule, then they have to do their job and make sure there's not going to be this disproportionate impact on our small businesses.
Right.
Because the one size fits all out of Washington, D.C. does not work. We know that in every area, it never works.
Right. Agreed.
So
Well, I'm excited to bring on Rafael.
yeah, let's bring Rafael on. So excited to have him on. We haven't talked to him in quite a few years. Rafael Cuellar is the owner of a ShopRite grocery store in Passaic, New Jersey. I think I'm pronouncing that right now, which he has run since 2005. He was the first Hispanic owner in the ShopRite cooperative. By knowing the consumers and keeping an eye on trends and leading the store associates, he doubled the store's sales in just 8 years. He grew up in his family grocery store, learning the ins and outs from a young age. From what I understand, he was a really young age too.
Yeah.
He has been honored in the New Jersey Food Council for being one of the top four leaders in the industry. Wow, Rafael, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Good morning, Elaine. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, Rafael, it's great to see you again. It's been a couple of years, and boy, it's been quite a doozy with COVID and everything. And so, first of all, how's business? How are you? I know that you've had some challenges throughout the COVID process and up there in New Jersey. Let's start with that first of all.
So, I mean, what can I tell you? COVID was interesting times. It definitely was interesting times, but we've done well. I mean, luckily, most of my businesses were essential businesses, so they were able to stay operational. I did have some businesses that had to shut down, but again, because we're a little bit diversified, we were able to do okay and survive the pandemic, in spite of all the craziness.
Now I know that you have your shop right. What other businesses have you added since you and I have spoken?
So we added another shop right but it's actually a liquor store. So we actually own one of the largest liquor stores in the co-op,
Oh
and
wow,
and I also got into some franchising. So we opened up a Crunch franchise, and I also
oh
have a small manufacturing company in Mexico that manufactures vertical hydroponic racking systems for vertical growth.
wow, wow. That is pretty diversified there, Rafael.
Yeah, all over the
It's
place.
so. What made you actually, Rafael, move into that different areas in addition to the grocery business, which I know is very very challenging.
Well, I think that's part of it. The grocery business is very, very challenging, and we wanted to have some growth. And growth within our grocery co-op was very difficult. It's a co-op that's owned by 50 members, and I'm surrounded by a lot of bigger members, so it was very hard to expand in my area. So I just started looking for other opportunities. Liquor was an opportunity, and really what happened was a supermarket down the street from us closed
Hmm.
down, and they went dark. And once they went dark, we looked at the building and said, well, we might as well keep it from ever being a supermarket again, and decided to open up the liquor store. And then eventually we split that building in half because it was a supermarket, so it was a large building. And we took one half and turned it into a liquor store. And then the other half, eventually, a year or two later, we turned it into the gym. And the gym franchise has done very well so far. And we've actually just recently, in the last year or so, bought out 9 more licenses to develop 9 more gyms. So
Wow,
we're
wow, that's amazing. Obviously, you've had quite the story to get to where you are today, and you and I have had the pleasure of chatting about that. But if you could kind of walk us through how you got to where you got today in your
sure.
story, because it is fascinating.
Sure. So my family actually migrated here from Cuba. They initially went to Spain, where I was born, and then realized that Spain, because of its, being a socialist country, the lack of opportunity was there, and then the other problem was the healthcare issue. So they decided to come to the U.S. So my father came to the U.S. and opened up a small mom and pop like grocery store, a bodega, pretty much, in Paterson, New Jersey. And then that years later, about a decade later, he sold that business to his partner and then moved off on his own into another family business, another supermarket, a little bit bigger than the one we had initially, probably about 12,000 square feet, and owned that until the day he passed away. While my dad did that, I worked in the business since it started. So I started working in the grocery business since I was about 6. And it's funny, a lot of people ask me, you started working at 6, what did you do? I'm like, I did what I pay adults to do today when I was 6 years old. But I grew up in that business and learned everything through it. I mean, I was a butcher by the time I was 12, and I was running
Wow.
a store by the time I was 17. But then I decided I was going to leave the business, and I actually joined the military. So I joined the Navy when I was 17, got a scholarship, became an officer, and was in the Navy for a little bit over 9 years.
Wow.
And unfortunately, I had to get out of the Navy because my dad passed away. He passed away very
Mm.
abruptly, and the business was still there. So I had to take care of my family. My mother was elderly. My brother had some problems, and I said, "Well, I need to leave." I resigned my commission, and I came out of the military world back into the business world. And I took over my dad and my mom's small business and ran that for about a decade. Grew it significantly, sold it, and then while I was in the preparations to go to medical school, I got tapped on the shoulder by this co-op, which is a Wakefern Food
Mm.
Cooperative. They're actually the largest retail co-op in the United States. And they had asked me if I wanted to become a member, and they gave me an opportunity, and I've been doing that ever since and just kind of expanding. So we started with the grocery store, and the grocery store has grown and become a pretty significant business. And then we, like I said earlier, we bought the liquor store a couple of years back, probably about, oh, it's almost 7 years now. Uh, 7 years for the liquor
Wow.
store. The gym's now coming up on its fourth year. And then,
Mm.
we're expanding into more gyms. And about 7, 8 years ago, too, we opened up the small manufacturing company in Mexico, which is that's actually a partnership, but I own a majority share of it. And we do, like I said,
Okay.
manufacture vertical hydroponic racking systems. So that's kind of been
Now,
the very encapsulated version of the trajectory of where we are today.
yeah, no, that's great. Now, New Jersey, not exactly the bastion of conservatism there.
Oh,
Uh,
I like to call it,
regulations, I mean, must be killing you. Taxes. I mean,
yeah.
how are you surviving in the state of New Jersey?
Well, I like to call it the People's Republic of New Jersey. But that being said, Uh, we manage. I mean, the reality of it is that it is difficult. It's a really hard state to have growth in because of all the regulation, because of the congestion, because of everything else. It's not a very business friendly state as we would, say. I mean, I sit on the board of directors of the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce, and we find that it's difficult dealing with the state many times, and there's always a lot
Wow.
of pushback. It's a very, very liberal state, so business is usually not first on the list.
Hmm.
How's the regulatory side of things in the liquor business? I mean, I'm in the South, and I know it's hard no matter what. So it's got to be really difficult in New Jersey.
Yeah, it's not the easiest thing in the world. I mean, one example is in New Jersey, you can only hold two liquor licenses, and that's it. So if you want to expand in that business, it's almost theoretically impossible. Some people get around it by going ahead and giving two licenses to their wives and two licenses to their kids and things like that, but that's kind of the only way to work around it. So that's a difficult part of it. But then there's also a lot of regulation, and you kind of get used to it when you live in these states. You get used to dealing with like
Hmm.
all the pushback and all the regulation stuff, and you just kind of adapt to it. And it's an old military thing, right? You adjust, adapt, and overcome. And that's kind of how we live here, as a business,
Mhm.
and we survive. But not that it's the easiest environment to survive in. And there's also on
I have
top of that,
friends that.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, on top of that, there's also a lot of congestion and a lot of competition because of that, because it's small state with a lot of people living in it. So,
I have friends that spent a couple years in Germany for her husband's job, and when they first went over there, it was a huge change, just a sea change, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But one of the things she talked about was how everyone just kind of accepted that service was worse, service, things were slower, that their bureaucracy was insane to do anything to get your driver's license. It just, people just, and she used that word, people just accepted that that's how things are, and of course, coming from, Orlando, Florida, she was, the surface capital of the country, basically. It was a tough transition to basically accept bad service, slow service, bureaucracy, red tape, and everything under the sun. But you sound just like her, actually, and you're in this country.
it's sad to say, but I mean, some of that is very true. And I say it more from the perspective of like the services side on the federal or state or things like that are difficult. They are difficult in a state like this. There's not a lot of opportunity for you to push back on the state. It's kind of their way or the highway. And I mean, again, you just adjust and adapt to it. There's not much of a choice. That being said, we've managed to be successful at it and we've managed to grow a business. But I would honestly say if, we had a little bit more opportunity, we probably would be a lot bigger company today. But it's hard because of that dynamic as well.
How many employees do you have amongst your
Amongst
businesses?
all the businesses, probably around 400.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, you guys made a lot of news. I know during the pandemic, there was that gym owner up there
That's
that
right.
kept opening. Was that anywhere near you, or did you follow
Uh,
that?
no, he's about an hour from us, and yeah, of course I followed it because it was just it was somewhat damaging, unfortunately, because then everybody got really focused in on. So, we tended to just abide by the rules and do everything we needed to do, not as much as, even though whether I agreed with them or not, to be totally honest with you, but it was just, again, easier to acquiesce almost than to go ahead and fight it. As you can see with that poor guy, I mean, he just got railroaded. I mean, they fined him hundreds of thousands of dollars. They kept closing his business down. They kept sending the police over slash the Gestapo or whatever you want to call it, to keep him at bay. I mean, it was a really hard time, and that really hurt, the business per se in the overall perspective, because I think to a certain degree that kept gyms shut down just that little bit longer, just because of like the stuff that he might have done.
Yeah. Is that how it felt? You called him the Gestapo. Is that how it kind of felt?
Kind of, yeah. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, not that I've had that experience, but just from being modestly versed in history, it kind of felt that way. It really felt like, you have to do what we say, and if you don't do
Yeah.
what we say, there's going to be ramifications. And that was a really kind of a scary time. It really was a scary time.
You have a liquor business and you've got the grocery store too. So the liquor stores were considered essential and stayed open. Did you get shut down?
No, we did not. We stayed open, and actually, the liquor business did very well. I'm not going to complain about that. It spiked, and then obviously, as everything opened back up and stuff, the liquor business went back to normal, back to what it was before. But we definitely got a spike there. The
Yeah.
grocery business was different. The grocery business had a really big spike before, and then it had a massive drop off afterwards, because in New Jersey, for example, there was time frames where it was really unclear what you could or couldn't do. So one of the things was you could only have X percentage of your business capacity in the store. I think it was something like 20% or something like that. So I have a 65,000 square foot I'm sorry, 65,000 square foot grocery store, and I was only allowed to have, I think, 150 people in it at a time. I mean, every shift for me is usually about 80 employees. So that meant I could only have about 70, 80
Wow.
customers in the store. So I had lines of customers outside in masks waiting to get into the store while 80 people shopped. It was is insane. It was crazy time. And that, then there were also things that happened during the pandemic where, again, things were very unclear. So if somebody caught COVID that worked for you, which we had probably 5 or 6 employees have to, caught COVID, you had to shut that entire section of the store down. So I remember I had to shut down our hot food department at one point. I had to shut down my meat department at one point, and you shut them down for
Hmm.
weeks. It wasn't like you shut it down for a day or two. You shut it down for weeks, and then you were able to reopen after, like, people were all cleared and this and that. And it was a struggle. It was definitely a struggle. Now, luckily, that didn't last too long. I think it lasted maybe about 6, 8 weeks. By the time it was all settled out, and people then started saying, "Oh, well, you can sanitize, you can do this," but that impacted the business super negatively. So by the time it was all said and done, people think grocery stores had this massive boom, and you did right before the pandemic. But during the pandemic, especially in the beginning, we had this massive drop off, and then it kind of leveled off. So by the time it was all said and done, that sine curve ended up being, up, down, and then right back to the line. So it all ended flat. It ended up being the same.
Hmm.
Were you able to participate in the Paycheck Protection Program?
We were not. Our co-op, because we're such a big co-op, got really paranoid about the dynamic that was happening with some of the other big corporations out there that were getting demonized for taking the PPP loan. So they basically put out a mandate that nobody could take it, and if anybody had any kind of struggles, the co-op would lend you the money that you might need. Luckily, we were in a situation where we kind of stayed flat, so we didn't need the money. But that did affect some of our members.
So
Interesting.
Rafael, I heard you use the word acquiesce. And I know that's probably from your 7 years of military experience where you just figure out how to get it done. You work within the system,
Yeah.
which makes you a great businessman as well. But you know what Job Creators Network does, which is push back on regulations and overtaxation, which is pretty much your state. How do you recommend, or how do you see small business owners, where let's say they're in a similar situation but don't want to acquiesce or feel like if they do, they'll lose the farm eventually?
So, I mean, that's a really difficult question in a state like New Jersey, right?
Yeah.
It's so proliferated, the whole, I guess left side of thinking and the liberal side of thinking, that business is so at the bottom of the list almost, that there's really not much you almost can do. You just
Hmm.
have to work within whatever the system provides and whatever the system says is going to be next. So legislators aren't necessarily very, you know, serviceorial toward the business community, in my opinion. Some are,
Right.
but I mean, and some of the people in New Jersey really do fight this hard. I mean, the state chamber does, the New Jersey Food Council does. There are organizations that really
Right.
try to not only fight it but also work with it, right? Like work with the legislation and all the politicians that are out there and try to make it so it's cohesive. But it's definitely an uphill battle. I mean, it's really, again, a very difficult question in the sense that in New Jersey, I mean, the only thing you can really kind of do is try to, make it make sense for the people who are legislating so that they don't, come down too hard on the business community and that they can make it
Right.
work or workable.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really is a tough situation. I mean, because I know that, I mean, I guess like in New York, I mean, or New Jersey, people have just left to Florida. I mean, they've
Sure.
just given up, especially on the restaurant side. I mean, I guess it's a little hard to move your grocery business
Yeah.
down to Florida. I mean, we see a lot of restaurateurs that have exactly moved down there and moved to friendly red states, because it's just sometimes impossible to acquiesce. And the concern is, of course, that where does it stop? As we've been fighting a lot of the challenges. I think you and I first met when we were talking about the National Labor Relations Board and some of the
Yeah.
overreach there with unelected bureaucrats. But I guess I can understand why it would be a difficult situation for you, especially when a business that you can't really just pick up and move.
And listen, I mean, it's not only just the business, it's the family, right? You got your family
Right.
here,
That's
you've got
right.
everyone here, you've got your entire base here, you've developed over an entire lifetime. And it's not just me. I mean, thousands of business people who are in the same boat. So it's not as
Right.
easy to pick up and move as if you have, a restaurant and you have any connections or you have minimal connections. For us, it's a little bit more difficult. But again, that being said, I mean, to give it some positive swing is that we do figure it out, and there's thousands of businesses
Right.
in the state that do figure it out, and we make it work and we make it happen and so on and so forth. It's just, it is limiting, right? It's kind of like it's just this force that's holding you back constantly or constantly pushing against you. In spite of you being able to grow faster, you just can't, or not at all in some cases. That's why we diversified, right? We diversified not only because of the dynamics within our own co-op, but the dynamics of the state we live in.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you had your wish list, Rafael, let's say of the top three things that you could see change in your state to help you grow your business even further and hire more people, et cetera, where would the three areas be, or what would the three things be? And I want to talk about that later in terms of also in context of the American Small Business Prosperity Plan, which we launched at the end of last year, which are eight policy buckets basically that we're emphasizing. But I'd love to hear your point of view on those top three things that you would love to see change if you could.
Well, I mean, one of them is just red tape. I mean, obviously, all the red tape legislation stuff that, filling out so much paperwork to get the simplest things done.
Hmm.
The other one is I think, somewhat of the overreach in monitoring how businesses operate, everything from like the OSHA principles of stuff and things like that. Because I dealt with that when I was in the military, and it just feels like it's somewhat overreaching, especially when you have like a bigger business that really does it well. As I
Right.
mean, we have, when I say grocery store, we have a very decent sized business, and it's a big grocery store. I mean, we've been doing this for 40 years. We know what we're doing, but to have
Right.
inspectors come in and nitpick you to death on little things that just make no sense is kind of
Right.
crazy legislation stuff. And people do it
Mm.
almost to, I feel like sometimes it's just to justify their existence, unfortunately. Um, you know,
Right.
so
Oh yeah.
those are two of my wish list things, and I think the other one would be, obviously, overtaxation. I mean, I feel like we are overly taxed in the state from a business perspective and even from a citizen's perspective. It's just such a high tax state to survive here that you're constantly just paying more and more and more. And unfortunately, some of those costs get passed down to consumers, right? We have no choice but to
Right.
pass them down to consumers. So it's that double-edged sword where you get hit from all those angles and, end up at the end of the day, the people who need the easement the most don't get it because the businesses aren't getting it. So you can't pass it on to the consumer.
Curious because obviously the grocery industry now is kind of getting vilified because of they're saying that the enormous profits that you guys are taking and the profiteering that the grocery industry is taking. Um, how do you react to that? Because I know probably the truth, but I'd love from your perspective as somebody who obviously lives this day in and day out, for our listeners to hear what the truth really is.
So it's comical to me, right? Because again, I grew up in this business. So back in the early 70s, this business, the net profitability was probably about anywhere between 5 and 6% net profit, which is not a very high net profit to begin with. In today's world, you're looking at sub 1% most of the time net profitability in this business, if you're making it at all, right? There's just been so much pressure put on by some of the really big companies, right? I mean, Walmart's the biggest grocer on earth, and they put a lot of pressure on the system, and then that trickles
Right.
down through a whole bunch of other businesses that have done the same thing. But it's not just that. I mean, again, it's the overall pressures of the system. There's so much legislation, there's so much things that you have to pay for to make sure that you're in compliance with this, that, and the other thing. It just whittles away at the profit and keeps on whittling away at it and whittling away at it. And, over the last 40, 50 years, it went from about, like I said, 5, 6% to less than one.
What about inflation? The inflationary pressures we've been dealing with for the last 2 years. I mean, we've been dealing with, 40-year highs and then just historically sticky inflation. It just doesn't go away.
No, that's been a brutal thing too. I mean, inflation does not help my business because it's just a clear pass on. It's not like all of a sudden you're making more net, even though you're charging more for costs of goods. It's because you're getting charged more for cost of goods from the wholesale perspective, right? In my situation, it's a little different because we are our own wholesaler, but they're getting it from the CPGs and from all the manufacturers. So that pricing is just kind of a pass through. It's not like we're all of a sudden making all this extra money because we're charging people more money or we're charging customers more. It's just a pass through. So at the end of the day, the net ends up being about the same.
Now, Rafael, really quickly for our listeners, because I'm not sure everybody understands the difference between, let's say, a regular grocery chain and a co-op. Can you explain that?
Sure, a regular grocery chain, most regular grocery chains out there, somebody like a Safeway or a Kroger or somebody like that is just a big corporation. It's a big corporation. It's got a president, CEO, so on and so forth. Not that we don't, we have that as well, but we're owned by only 50 members, 50 people. And we did have a time when some of our members were publicly traded, but today I don't think any of them are. That being said, because we're only 50 members, we basically all come together cooperatively and buy together, merchandise together, market together.
Mm,
And that creates a savings that allows us to be competitive with some of the really huge companies out there, like, again, Walmart and, you know, um,
mm.
Kroger and some of those companies. So, I mean, I
Okay.
guess the best way to encapsulate, the cooperative versus the corporation kind of thing.
Yeah,
Corporations
no,
have
no, no,
massive
that's
buying
helpful.
power. Corporations have massive buying power. So if I were to try and compete with, let's say again, Walmart by myself, it would be
Right.
almost impossible, right? I just could never get the price point to be competitive with them. But because there's 50 of us and cumulatively own about 400 grocery stores altogether, that allows us to have
Right.
enough buying power and this and that to come close, or at least close enough where we're
Yeah.
competitive.
Rafael, that's something that I try to make that point when I talk about the challenges of small business owners, especially in this inflationary period. That larger businesses have the opportunity to take advantage and leverage buying power, purchasing power, right? Whereas small businesses are really getting hit on the chin, even worse
Mhm.
than businesses in general, because they don't have the opportunity to leverage that kind of buying power. I mean, it sounds like obviously through the co-op that enables you guys to leverage that. But you were a smaller business before, so talk to us about that as well, because I think that's a really important thing for people to understand the difference between a small business and a large business when it comes to fighting inflation, for example.
Sure. I mean, listen, the reality of it is that, you know, I've been a co-op member now for coming up on 20 years. So it's been a while, but I was a small business independent, completely independent small business for another 20 years, right? Or, you know, more
Hmm.
than 20 years before that. And one of the reasons I got out was because I saw that writing on the wall. I saw these big companies getting bigger and bigger and more powerful in the grocery industry. And I
Hmm.
said, we need to get out of this because if not, we're not going to be able to survive in the future. And I
Right.
remember there's a huge industry show, Food Marketing Institute show. It's called FMI.
Right.
It's this big industry show
FMI.
that happens every year. And about 20 some odd years ago, I remember going to an FMI, actually almost 30 years ago now, and going to an FMI. And they usually have, you know, somebody who's a futurist come on and talk about the future of the industry and the future of everything, just in general. This guy got up
Yeah.
there and he said, every 5 years moving forward from now on, the independent industry is going to get cut in half. And I literally remember scoffing at it and saying, this guy's insane. That'll never happen.
Right.
And lo and behold, 5 years later, I went to FMI again, and the industry, independent industry, had gotten cut in half. And it was such a wake up call at that moment for me that I said, I need to vacate, well, not we, I said, I need to vacate this now while the going is good. And
Right.
that's when I made the decision to sell my company and go back to medical school, which is kind of what I was going to do. And then the
Mm.
opportunity with Wakefern happened, and I saw the opportunity with a co-op and being able to do that cooperative buying and growing together. And it was already kind of a big company to begin with back 20
Yeah.
years ago. And we've done nothing but grow since then, thank God. But you know, it really was an eye opener from, you know, being a really small independent, you know, mom and pop to being able to come into this big almost conglomerate of companies, you know, together, or conglomerate of owners that, you know, made it a little bit more palatable to be competitive with the big companies out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually I remember those FMI conferences because if you remember, I used to work in the CPG world,
Right.
Nestle, Pepsi. So
Sure.
good old Chicago McCormick place, if I remember
That's right.
correctly.
That's correct. I don't think they have it
We
there
used to.
anymore, but yeah, they used
Yeah,
to.
no, no, no. They pulled out because of all the unions. Actually,
Right. I think
they
they went
couldn't
to
afford to
Vegas.
actually operate it there.
Yeah, they went to Vegas probably about a little bit over a decade ago. But yeah,
Yeah,
I remember those fondly. I went to those for years, for probably more than 20 years. I went to FMI conferences.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember those future cast presentations. They were always very interesting. But yeah, thank you for explaining that because that is such an important difference. This difference, between small and large businesses, and folks just
Sure.
don't understand that really, and the challenges that our small businesses actually do face in this kind of environment.
It is unbelievable. I'm actually always shocked at how, you know, a lot of these guys have actually managed to survive for the last 20 years. And the reality of it is that, you know, in urban markets, they have more survivability because, you know, big chains aren't necessarily in urban markets, right? Like you're not putting a lot of Walmarts in the Bronx, right? You might put one in, but then the Bronx has got
Right,
so many people and it's so diverse that, you know, necessarily not everybody's going there. So then you have all the bodegas and you got all these guys who are surviving, but there's also where you have the whole food desert problem and the issues that arise because these guys are, you know, so much more expensive than per se, you know, the competition. And people shop
right,
them because they don't have much of a choice, also because people have limitations in transport and everything else. And it's not the same as when you live in the burbs and you can go ahead and buy, you know, a $300 shopping cart and take it home. So when you live in an
right,
apartment in the middle of like Queens and, you know, you've
right.
got limited space. So you've got to go to the bodega every day to buy because you can't.
Hmm.
You can't stock up on a 24 pack of toilet paper, right? So
Right. Yeah.
you're buying one roll, but you're paying, you know, whatever, $2 for a roll of toilet paper as opposed to $10 for 24, $12 for 24, whatever the
Right.
case may be.
Well, Rafael, in our last couple of minutes, I wonder if you could just share with us what's next for you. You've done so much in the 4 or 5 years that we haven't talked to you, and diversified so much. What do you see on the horizon for you?
Well, like I said, I mean, I've got another 9 gyms in my pipeline, so that's the next thing. Hopefully, we'll get them done sooner rather than later. It takes a little bit of time, especially right now. The lending environment's not very great because of inflation and interest rates and everything else, so
Yeah.
that's made it a little bit more difficult. But that's our immediate next thing. But we're kind of going into franchising. I really liked the franchising model. It's kind of a segue after the co-op model. and it's a way for us to expand. I mean, I call them a business in a box, right? It's like if you're good at following direction and you're good at doing what they say, your odds of success are very, very high. And that's another thing. I mean, it's hard to succeed from a scratch business today. Small independent scratch business, something you started out of like, out of your mom and pop's garage kind of thing, is not something that is, in my opinion, as doable as it was before. Um, and just because of the difficulties with, everything from legislation to economy to everything else. So franchises have made a lot more sense for me. Matter of fact, we're actually launching a fully promoted franchise in September, which we're opening up as well.
Hmm.
So that'll be another one under our belt. And then we are just looking at different, franchising opportunities and things that are out there to see what makes most sense. There's a couple other ones that are on the perspective right now, but that's kind of the idea over the next 10, 15 years is to grow out the franchising model. And then eventually, to build this small conglomerate of businesses that, will either liquidate or grow or depending on what happens. And then eventually, well, the plan is really eventually to end up with either a small private equity firm or a family office and kind of run things that way.
Oh, that's great. Hey, Rafael, I have to jump in and ask one quick question though, because
Yeah, yeah.
as you focus on franchising, and you're in franchising right now, there's a movement in Congress from the Democrats, especially on this PRO Act, which basically is impacting the whole joint employer issue, which basically, gives you the ability as a franchisor not to be responsible, for example, the labor actions of your franchisee. The PRO Act is really going to change that, is my understanding, and there's a big push for that. What's your thoughts on that, and how do you see that affecting the franchising industry if they actually get their way on this?
Oh, I think that could cripple the franchise industry, right? I mean, all of a sudden, franchisors become responsible for every single franchisee's like labor decisions and everything else each individual does. It
Hmm.
could totally cripple that industry. One of the reasons this works is because you're a small independent company within this mechanism. But if the mechanism becomes the company, there's no need for the franchisee anymore. You might as well just let everybody be corporations. So it
Hmm.
just kills the whole small business perspective of it in my opinion. Not to mention it would no longer be lucrative for franchisors to go ahead and develop franchisees. Why would you bother? Might as well just do your
Right.
own thing. And so that'll limit growth for franchises, period, because there's no franchisee that they would want to take on. Or if they did, the the structure would have to change so dramatically where franchisees were so tied to the franchisor, not that they're not, but so much more so that it just would make it impractical for a franchisor to develop, a franchise model.
Well, the justification of Congress, I guess the Democrats in Congress, to do this is because you're such an evil person, that supposedly that you don't respect your labor, you don't respect your employees, and so they have to do this so that to give your employees more protection from evildoers like you.
Yeah, well, that is one of those just almost moronic statements, in my opinion. I mean, the reality of it is
Uh,
that I I I love my employees. My employees are my family. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
10,000 times more so than like a Walmart's would be. You know what I mean? I really do care what happens to them. I am concerned about
right.
what the economy does and how that affects them and so on and so forth. So many times that I'm concerned about them that it hurts my own personal bottom line because I will take away from myself to give to them. So
Right.
if that's evil, then evil I am.
We hope that more franchisors actually speak out on this, because I'm really concerned, Rafael, that this is something that they are going to keep on pushing until they get it done, and we have to keep on pushing back on this.
Now, listen, the reality of it is the day that happens will probably be the day that I sell all my franchises. Really,
Yeah,
literally, if that
yeah,
situation happens, then I mean, within the next day, I will start looking for the exit because not only will it devaluate my franchises, but it'll make it so that it's no longer palatable. Because again, I know what'll be the next steps on the franchisor side to the franchisee.
right, right. Well, thank you for that perspective, Rafael. I think it's
No, of
important to
course,
get that out.
sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that and sharing your perspective about your employees. We do always speak in terms of small business owners and their employees. It's their family of employees, and the difference there in that perspective is so important. And that's part of why we wanted to do this podcast, is so that America could hear, on a bigger platform, how small business owners, sort of navigate everything from a policy perspective, and dealing with sort of the death by a thousand cuts on taxes and regulations, but also how much they really care about their employees. And they do care when they're in good news with, marriages and pregnancies and new cars and new homes, to the bad news. And that's important, because when your employees feel like they can rely on you, not just for the job but for support, that's very important. And you're right, maybe a Walmart's not like that, and it just can't be, not with that many employees. There's no way. But when you've got a smaller group around you that you can care about, and you may not be able to give them stock options and things like that, but you can care. We had somebody on last week who said, I can't do all these things that big companies can do, but I can care. And that's really important for people to understand that.
Yeah, that couldn't be more true. I mean, I, I couldn't have or do anything that I do without my employees, is the way I look at it. So again, not only do I care about them, I realize and I value how much they do, and I value who they are, because if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have what we have. And it's kind of this mutual thing, right? You provide to them, they provide to you. And that's, I think what business should be built on the basis of real business. And again, there's something to be said about these big corporations that become monolithic, but there's also something to be said about small business. I mean, and most business in America is small business, not big business.
Yeah.
Most people are employed by small business, not big business. Regardless of how many employees big business has, small business still has its big position in the world, or at least in America. And
Yeah.
I think that, devaluing that is sad. And I see, unfortunately, that, a lot of legislators devalue that because they don't understand it. I think some of it has to do with just lack of understanding. Some of it is politically motivated, but I think most of it is just sheer lack of understanding. That's why I think JCN does such a great job, because you're so informative about it. And you push back on the things that some people don't understand. And I do genuinely think some legislators listen and they sit back and they say, wow, I didn't realize that. At least I've seen that happen in my state, where some legislators just don't realize it. And organizations like
Yeah.
the New Jersey Food Council and the Chamber of Commerce and things like that really help, because they'll sit down with those legislators and their staff and say, this is what you don't understand about what you're trying to do and what the impact is going to be. So, and sometimes, like I said, sometimes it's just sheer politically motivated and there's nothing you can do when that mechanism is in place. But
Right.
if you can make somebody realize that this legislation is really going to be punitive to business, and that net impact is this to the community, it makes them think sometimes, I think, at least I hope.
Thank you so much for saying that. We really appreciate it. And the purpose is not for us to bash the big business, but to really elevate, amplify the small business voice so that people do understand all of that, because
Yeah.
there is an extreme lack of understanding about small businesses. And that's what we've really always strived to do, is amplify those voices for small businesses. But we have actually come to the end of our time. I'm sad to say, because it's been such a great conversation.
No, it was
But I
my
want to thank
pleasure.
you so much for joining Main Street Matters,
Yeah.
America's small business megaphone, which is very fitting after this conversation. Please subscribe to our show at salempodcastnetwork.com. And thanks so much again.
Thanks, Rafael.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.